Let us begin, friends. I actually wanted to ask us to spend just a couple minutes in silent worship together before we begin. Maybe your mornings were entirely serene and peaceful. Maybe your mornings were like mine and you got up slightly later than you intended with your to-do list looming and your car with less gas than you remembered. And traffic worse than you planned. So if you had a morning like that, I'd ask, let's just spend a couple minutes in silent worship before we engage verbally with one another. Mindful of the presence of the Spirit and the presence of one another together, let us begin. So when I walked in, it was mentioned to me another, something like another teaching or another reflection from Catholicism. And it is true that the inspiration for this for me comes out of a Catholic theologian. But I do think it's uniquely, the reason it's resonant with me, I think speaks to what led me to the Quaker tradition. So I hope some of it resonates with you as well. When we were planning this quarter, this month, we thought about the proximity to the Christian celebration of Easter, and also recognized that next week a lot of folks would be out. And so we were thinking about, at one point we thought about doing a forum on Lent, and then other things filled the Lenten season. So then we arrived up to now, which is often known as Holy Week. And so we said, well, we'll do one on the Paschal mystery, which is something that's of interest to me. So I want to begin just sort of unpacking what even that means, what Paschal is trying to speak to. And I think there's probably some debate about this, but because it works neatly with this paradigm, I'm going to go with this particular interpretation of the roots of Paschal. So some say that Paschal comes from the word Passover. And of course, the Christian celebration of Easter essentially coincides with the Jewish tradition of Passover. And so Paschal comes from the Latin word for Pascha, which comes from the Greek word, which comes from the Hebrew word Pesach for Passover. Now, if that is true, that is where the word comes from and what its roots are, and if we do some interpretation of what Passover speaks to, which I think works for this reflection. It's speaking to a transition, a journey, a passage through. The imagery of the Passover is the Spirit of God passing over the Jews in the Exodus story in Egypt. And so there is a passage and journey through something that is part of Passover. And so the Paschal mystery and the Paschal tradition carries some of those same connotations. So for me, the reason this framework that I want to speak to today and then have some queries for us around, the reason it resonates with me is I'm not someone who the resurrection, the traditional story of the resurrection, made a lot of sense for. It was not something that I found resonance or meaning in, and I couldn't quite get it. Now, I think for the Quaker tradition, we spend a little less time, usually, at least within our meeting, thinking about Christ, but I do think we spend a little more time thinking about the Spirit, which I think this framework speaks to. So today in the Christian tradition, it's known as Palm Sunday, and we are entering into the entire week of Holy Week, which then is the inauguration of the Easter season, which is an entire season, which is then followed by the season of Pentecost. So the Paschal mystery actually speaks to multiple things happening over a long extended period of time. So what I'm about to lay out is not original to me. It comes from a theologian named Ron Rolheiser. He's a Canadian theologian who at one point was president of Oblate School of Theology, which is my hometown of San Antonio, which is how I came to know of him and his views on this topic. So he says that the Paschal mystery essentially speaks to 5 distinct movements. The first is Good Friday, followed by the resurrection, followed by the 40 days that preceded the ascension, and finally, the final movement, which is Pentecost. And those 5 movements are what the Paschal mystery is, the cycle of the Paschal mystery. And so he says that we've somewhat missed the mark in understanding what the Paschal mystery is actually trying to speak to us about, and that it's not a singular event. It's actually a continuous series of events that each of us experience throughout our lives. And so he reframes them in this way. Good Friday is about death and loss, which we each experience multiple times in our lives. Resurrection is the new life that follows that death and loss. Because so far, each of us have woken up each morning still alive. So we've experienced loss, we've experienced death, we're still actually alive. And so resurrection is that new life that follows the loss that we experience. It's the thing that comes after each day. 40 days, he says, is where we've really spent less time reflecting. 40 days is a period of time that follows when the new life begins, which is the time for grieving the old life that preceded the new life that we had. Ascension is after we've taken that time to grieve and mourn. And it's when we truly let go of the old life, when we make the choice to not cling to that old life. And Pentecost, which can only come after we've let go, after we've mourned, after we've grieved, and after we've let go, Pentecost is the reception of the Spirit or the new life that we are already living. And it can only come when we've let go of that old life. So Good Friday, I think we all get. I can imagine that we've all experienced a death of something. whether that's the death of a loved one, the death of a dream, the death of a relationship, a conception of who we are as parents or as children, the conception of the concept that we have of who our parents are or who our children are. All of these things at various points, I think we've experienced the death of one or more of those things. Resurrection, I think we also get, at least in concept. It is what comes after. Now, he makes an important distinction that I think is relevant, which is that resurrection does not mean resuscitation. Resuscitation is the return to your old life, the way it was. Resurrection is new life. It is not the life we used to have. So there is a major distinction, which, the signal for if we're yearning more for resuscitation than resurrection is the words, if only. If only I was young again. If only it was how life used to be. If only this was still the case. Those all speak to not a new life, but a yearning for the old life. And so then we come to the part that I think we spend way less time in, which is the 40 days. I think most of the time, particularly in the time of Easter, we do these things in quick succession. Good Friday, the death; Easter, the resurrection; the end of story. Now we go back to our regular day-to-day. And what Ron Rolheiser says is essentially these 40 days of grieving and mourning spell the difference between a terminal death and a Paschal death. A terminal death meaning we hit the roadblock and we're truly at a brick wall in terms of embracing something new, rather than a Paschal death, which is not only a death, but the appropriate grieving and mourning that allows for the letting go and allows for the reception of the spirit that we need for a new life. So that may mean, in some of these examples, the spirit that allows someone to think, my 20s are gone, my 30s are gone. What does it mean to be in my 40s? What does it mean to be in my 50s? What does it mean to be in my 60s? What does it mean to be in my 70s or 80s? And what is the life and gifts and opportunities that I have for this moment, not just a yearning for the moments that used to be. That's an example, a small example of the new spirit for the new life that we have. So I want to pause for a minute and just ask us to reflect on, and we can respond, we don't have to, but are there any examples we can think of these deaths that we've experienced that called us to something new? And maybe we went through that cycle serenely and joyfully, and maybe we went through them with some resistance. But I just ask us to pause for a moment and think about what are those deaths that we need to name where we've either already in life or we're still struggling to claim that new life. And then I'll have a second query after that one.
I can think of at least two that I've experienced in the past 10 years. Once is retiring from work. The relationships I had with people that I built up over 30 years, routine of, knowing I'm going to be doing this at this time and that at that time and so on, that occupied, a large part of my physical and emotional life suddenly stopped. And June 30th, 2006 or something now, 2012, June 30th, 2012, boom, all that just ended. And there was certainly a period of confusion and loss and adjustment that took, well, at least a year, maybe more, to fully accept that there was something new and learn what a new life was. And then sadly, just 2 years after that, my wife died. And that's certainly a total change of life when you've spent almost 50 years with one person. And suddenly you're alone. And suddenly you're not part of a couple. There are many, many things that change, many things in your self-perception and your expectation and your routine. But ultimately, I think both have wound up bringing me from routine and opened me to different experiences, both spiritual and physical and travel and things like that. So I think after a period of much more than 40 days, been open to the spirit in multiple ways. So your interpretation of the cycles of the theologians certainly resonates.
That reminds me of there's two things that your example reminds me of. One is clearly, yes, 40 days is not a magic number. And scripturally, usually 40 days just means a long time. But it also, the example, particularly of your wife, reminds me that this, I'll call it a truth. This potential truth isn't just true for individuals. It's true for what I would call institutions. And I think, even though sometimes I think some people run with this in a negative way, of the family as an institution or a system. It is a unit that is separate from just an individual, or it's more than just an individual. And so I think families have these experiences in ways that are not just, death in the traditional sense, but in other things as well, other types of transitions. And institutions like, let's just say, a meeting or a congregation. I am a student at Earlham School of Religion, so I meet a lot of friends across the country who have various roles in their meetings. And, in lots of different examples, they're dealing with meetings are being laid down, or meetings are really grappling with. And it's not actually just friends meetings. There's people from other traditions who are dealing with the exact same life cycle of a congregation or a meeting, where there's definitely, even if the meeting isn't being laid down, there's definitely a feeling of loss or change from what used to be that no longer is. So institutions have that as well. Institutions like families or meetings or congregations.
I was struck, as I often am when we talk about these things, or things like this, that this time sequence, that's implicit, or that's explicit in all this, sometimes isn't. Sometimes all this stuff all happens at once. And I think a lot of times that's almost part of my daily routine. There's a small death and a grieving, some reflection, and then coming to something else, you know, and I think that's and you know, in the middle of your period of reflection, you can experience another loss. For me, like Steve, it was a big deal when I retired. I retired at the beginning of 2020. Guess what else happened at the beginning of 2020? COVID. So I'm still, and it took me a couple of years to figure out what was due to retirement and what was due to COVID, you know. And I think that the idea that all this stuff can happen all at once, you know, and that's, you know, but for purposes of understanding it, we stretch it out and give it a sequence in time. I think that's powerful.
I think that's absolutely right. It's much easier to explain it as a singular, you know, various events in a movement, but you're absolutely right. And I think it's also absolutely right, and I think that's a great point. These aren't necessarily, I mean, I just emphasize that 40 days usually means a long time, but you're right. Within every single day, we have these cycles or experiences, or certainly can.
I'll just add one thing, and this is maybe tangential, but you know, speaking to the sequencing of things. So in the little town of 300 people in Iowa, where my brother lives, my mother used to live, there's a huge general store run by a Mennonite family, and it's become such a big deal that even though it's a small town of 300 people, people will come from miles around. It's almost become a tourist attraction. It's huge. The Amish come there and they sell their stuff on consignment, their quilts and things. And it's a big attraction. And somewhere, I think the first Sunday in June, people show up and the place is closed on the first Monday in June because it's Ascension Sunday. and they're very, very strict about that and about observing that time on the calendar. So at least for those, that Anabaptist tradition, I guess, I didn't know this, the Ascension is very, very important.
That's really interesting. I maybe others had different experience. I definitely didn't grow up where the Ascension was emphasized. Pentecost, I don't even know that it was truly emphasized, but it was emphasized more than Ascension. Now, the emphasis that Rollheiser makes is that the 40 days of Ascension is what the Christian tradition emphasizes the least, and it's a extremely critical component. You cannot get to Pentecost, the new spirit, until you've gone through the period of grieving and mourning that the 40 days is meant to indicate. And now, you know, the other thing I think that is important to say on that is I'm actually not a particularly, I have, for various reasons, become more familiar, but I'm not someone who roots myself particularly in scripture. Or Christian scripture specifically. And recently I had to do more of that and became a bit more aware of how different the various gospel stories are from one another, and how often within the cycle, within the traditional pageantry of either Easter or Christmas, multiple of them are blended to make a single story that does not exist in any of them individually. And Easter and Holy Week is an example of that. And so I've spent more time recently in the Gospel of John. And what Rollheiser makes the point of is, you know, the Gospel of John does not have the Ascension. two other gospels do in the way that we imagine, in the way that I think is most often illustrated in art. And so Rollheiser makes the point that John's gospel, instead of giving the story of the ascension, he just names what's happening. And some of the point that he and others have made is that if we think about it, Christianity was birthed out of an extremely traumatic event. I mean, this group's leader was tortured, which I think most people agree to some degree was a historical event, the crucifixion being a historical event more than the resurrection. So this leader was tortured and executed in a gruesome fashion. And then so you're trying to make sense of that. And that the ascension is precisely that, sort of the confusion of what is happening, what just happened. And so in the storytelling of trying to make sense of what happens, two of the gospels talk about the ascension in the way that's illustrated. What John has is Mary Magdalene meets Jesus at the tomb, and at first thinks he's a gardener, so essentially does not recognize him, does not recognize this new life, this new form. Perhaps because she was looking for it to look like the old, and because some interpret to say like he must not have appeared the same. We have no way of knowing what the storyteller meant, but that he must not have appeared the same. And so when she recognizes his voice, she runs to embrace him. I forget whether she actually does, but the words that Jesus then says in the story is, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." And then he says something along the lines, "which I must do in order for you to receive the Holy Spirit." He says, "Mary, do not cling to me." And so the fundamental point that he makes is that's the part where we often get stuck. The clinging, the lack of mourning, the lack of grieving. And that's what prevents us from receiving the Spirit that we need for the new life that we are going to live. Retirement probably calls for a new spirit, probably calls for a new way of living than, I say that I'm speculating, but I imagine calls for a new spirit than the one you previously had. I'm sure many of the examples we've named that's true. And what he says is you cannot receive that. It will not work until you've mourned and let go. And that you really can't let go until you've mourned. And then he makes a point, which I have less, it's not that I believe it less, but he explains it less. So I have less to add to describe it. But he says that not only must you let it go, you must allow it to bless you. You must receive the blessing that it had for you. And so the query that I would ask us to consider now is, they can be past examples that we've managed to let go of, or they can be things that we're grappling with now. But what are the things that we are currently clinging to that are preventing us from allowing something to bless us, mourning something and allowing ourselves to let it go in order to receive the Spirit for the new life that is a potential offering for us? us to name one of my own, because there's some additional queries I want us to consider on what we're clinging to. One that really resonated with me when I began to consider this idea is clinging to the idea of what I want a person to be. And I can actually think through the example of retirement. I desperately want my parents to retire. They are in their 70s and they work probably 9 or 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. They have a small business. And I really want them to retire. And when I see the sort of the stress they're under and the impact to their health, my reaction is out of sort of frustration and probably almost bitterness, that they're under such what I believe to be strain. And I just don't understand why they don't retire. And so I'm clinging to this idea of what I want my parents to be in this image. I have an image of them being able to sleep in and relax and take their time and be at peace. And I am desperately clinging to this image of the life I want them to have, which is not the life they're choosing for themselves. And that is not something I have yet fully let go of. But in this example, I named that one because I think we've talked about retirement. But I think in general, that example is also true. Sometimes I think what we cling to is not something necessarily about ourselves. It can also be an idea or a dream that we have for someone else that we love. A sibling who we desperately want to be different, and we're clinging to this picture of a different person for them, of who they are or could be, or a child. So that's one that I will name for myself. And others may want to share, but I want to add a little bit more to that query. So what Rolheiser speaks to in terms of reflecting on this, which I think is relevant to us, because I think, when I think about the Quaker tradition, I think for me, at its heart has been the willingness to be open to the Spirit. And so part of what resonates for me about this is the recognition that we can only truly receive that Spirit when we're ready, and that there's some work that goes into that to really be ready to receive that new Spirit. And so some of what Rolheiser makes the point of is if one thinks that they're not clinging to anything, that there's no death that they're clinging to think about in the here and now, what is a loss that is gnawing on you? What is a death you are experiencing now, even if you think you aren't clinging to it? And then to wonder, for whatever it is that pains your heart, in what ways have you already grieved it? And how do you need to grieve it? So if you consider where you feel loss, consider where and how have I grieved it? Where and how do I need to grieve it? And the idea that very often we on naming that pain and loss and sort of out of a instinct to just move on. And that we can't truly move on until we actually have named it and mourned it. And so, as we consider that question for ourselves, I would one of the things to consider is, where are we experiencing that gnawing? Where are we experiencing that pain and that loss? And how have we grieved it? And how do we need to grieve it? I'll ask us to consider for a few minutes.
I just want to say that for me, this idea of sort of arriving at a new spirit and a new life after something you were familiar with or a part of has ended. It's a very comforting idea. I think it's hard not to feel anxious sometimes, for me at least, about the state of the world or sort of the direction that the future seems to be heading. And it gives you a certain amount of comfort to know that there's been tremendous mourning and loss before, and that there can be, like you were saying, that blessing that you receive from that old life. And that to truly experience a sort of a new life beyond that is possible, and it's been done before, and it's almost sort of out of your hands what lives or ways of living will end, but it's entirely sort of in your control about how to take that 40 days and spend that grieving. And even if things seem to be sort of out of control and out of your control, that for yourself, you could still take the blessing from that old life and receive a spirit of a new life. And that things will be okay. And even if they're not okay in the way you imagine they would be, that there is a new spirit beyond this one.
Can I share?
Please.
Your sermon is very timely. For me, I had to put down one of my dogs 11 days ago. And I felt like the battle was between my mind and my heart. Because my heart said, why would you do this? But then my mind realized, like, I knew that I needed God to carry me through this and find a wisdom that could help me make the decision. And I'm still mourning that, even though other people talk about much greater losses, I still feel it, and I appreciate giving it time, the time that it needs, so that I can transform into my new life. I'll say the other dog is doing great. I didn't realize she was bullied, so she's really grown and loving life now. And the morning that we went and did it, I read a meditation and it talked about surrender. And I kind of hear you talking about that, where that was the component that was missing, me truly getting out of the way and letting God's will guide me correctly. And now more and more, I feel relief, not excitement, not exactly happiness, but I feel relief. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think sometimes we do think of the loss of pets and say, well, this doesn't compare to something or the other. But I'm reminded of another theologian who is still alive, and he talks about how every day he sees God, and he says, and the first and primary way I see God in my life is in my dog. And he has a much richer explanation of that. But if we do think of creation as a manifestation of God's glory, then I think it's not insignificant to see that within a beloved pet or animal. Because we're getting close to time, I just want to recap briefly. So this idea of the Paschal mystery, using the imagery from the Christian tradition, it sees Good Friday as death and loss, the loss of life. It does not need to be a terminal death if we let it be a Paschal death that we journey through. Easter is the resurrection, not resuscitation to the old life. It's a new life. So that new life begins before we've done anything. We are confronted with it. How we meet that moment depends on what happens next. So the 40 days is the time of readjustment. It's the time to grieve the old. And ascension is when we let go of the old. It's when we refuse to cling and allow the old life to bless us. So that 40 days, that's a time period where we are grieving and mourning. There is a thing happening before we let go. Ascension is when we let go, which then allows for what is described as Pentecost, the receiving of the new spirit for the new life that you are already living. And then he sort of makes the point that whatever died, you are not dead. Even as the wounds cut deep, your heart keeps beating. New life is here now. It requires us to mourn what was and refuse to cling to it to receive the new spirit that our new life requires. And that is Pentecost. And I just want to, before we close, just see if there's any closing sort of questions or counter perspectives or counter reactions or anything to what we talked about this morning.
I personally think that's a wonderful way to reinterpret the traditional Christian story of Christ's death and resurrection and dying for our sins, which never made any sense whatsoever to me. Much better.
Clearly, that's how I feel too.
Where does the word Pentecost come? Not like, linguistically, but where in the Bible is that from? Or
What word?
yeah, I recognize the name like the Pentecostal church, but I've never heard that word say it's just Pentecost.
Oh, I would need to go back and look. I can probably find out and then let you know before we end. It's specifically speaking to Pentecost is that primarily in Acts, the story of the reception of the Holy Spirit. So I know it's related linguistically to that, but I couldn't tell you like the Greek way it's connected.
Yeah, but I just had never heard that word, and I like that concept that it's about receiving receiving sort of a new life. I like that a lot.
Because I'm a big fan of Mary Magdalene, I'm going to close us with a poem that I think speaks to this. And I should say, again, nothing that I've shared today is like my own insight. It comes from this theologian, Ron Rolheiser, and he expounds on this in different books, but the one that I enjoy the most is one called The Holy Longing, which I think was a bestseller. It's certainly very good. And so he closes this chapter on the Paschal Mystery with this poem that imagines it being spoken by Mary Magdalene. And it comes out of him sort of making the point that Jesus said, "Mary, do not cling to me." And he says, what lies behind Jesus's reluctance to let Mary touch him? Mary Magdalene herself, had we ever found her gospel, would I suspect, explain it this way: I never suspected resurrection, and to be so painful, to leave me weeping with joy, to have met you alive and smiling outside an empty tomb. With regret, not because I've lost you, but because I've lost you in how I had you, in understandable, touchable, kissable, clingable flesh, not as fully Lord, but as graspably human. I want to cling despite your protest, cling to your body, cling to your and my clingable humanity, cling to what we had, our past. But I know that if I cling, you cannot ascend, and I will be left clinging to your former self, unable to receive your present spirit.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me.